Welcome to the Explainer. Let's just dive right into the dramatic 6th century epic of Saint Severus, exactly as it's depicted by Saint Athanasius of Antioch. If you think ancient theological manuscripts are just dry lists of rules and dates, well, you are in for a serious surprise today. We are looking at a text that genuinely reads more like a fantasy epic or a classic hero's journey. We've got prophecies, spiritual warfare, high-stakes court showdowns, and a protagonist who literally wields words like a two-edged sword. So we're going to unpack the story of Saint Severus, his massive struggle for his faith, and how a solitary monk ended up shaping the very foundations of an empire.
So, who is our historical champion? Saint Severus, the Patriarch of Antioch. In our source text, his life is framed as way more than just a standard biography. It's presented as a grand, heroic quest. The author, Saint Athanasius of Antioch, doesn't just want to give us a timeline of what Severus did. He really wants us to feel the cosmic weight of his actions. He's described as a roaring lion, a chosen warrior, who is basically destined to weed out corruption and defend his vision of the truth against completely overwhelming odds.
But to really grasp the stakes here, according to the manuscript, we actually have to rewind a bit. We start with this visceral prophecy delivered by his grandfather, which immediately thrusts us into a world of intense spiritual warfare. Long before Severus ever engaged in a single debate or wrote a theological treatise, his path was supposedly already laid out in a moment of divine revelation. His grandfather, who was a bishop that actually attended the Council of Ephesus, fell into a trance and received this message that completely sets the tone for the entire epic.
Part 1. The Grandfather's Prophecy. According to the text, his grandfather had this vision in Babylon predicting that a child named Severus would establish the rock of the orthodox faith, and do so through immense hardship. The prophecy stated that this future child would meet great adversity, be rejected by men, and be driven from church to church by kings and governors, but crucially, it promised that he would establish the rock of the orthodox by his true word. This instantly framed Severus not just as a smart scholar, but as a prophesied savior figure for his people. Even his name is significant here, literally meaning the Lord will save his believing people.
Moving on to part 2, a calling and baptism.
It's a pretty wild trajectory, honestly. We track a rapid transformation from an Athenian philosophy student reading Plato to a baptized monk surrounded by divine signs. Severus starts out in Athens, totally immersed in secular philosophy, but the text tells us that he and his friends decide to flee their teachers and turn their hearts to the Lord, journeying all the way to the church of Leontius the martyr. When they finally reach the baptistry to receive the sacrament, the manuscript claims a heavenly hand actually descended upon Severus's head, and a voice echoed 3 times to the crowd saying, "It befits him." And right from there, he enters the monastery, trading the tools of a philosopher for the rigorous, intense spiritual training of a monk. The real turning point of this transformation is rooted right in this specific moment. The source describes a supernatural encounter where Leontius the martyr commands him to basically abandon worldly philosophy altogether and put on the helmet of salvation. The martyr appears to Severus while he's just sitting there reading Plato and explicitly tells him to stop reading unprofitable things. He's commanded to seek the garment of monasticism so he can learn how to wrestle with might, extinguish the fires of those who oppose his church, and cry aloud in Antioch, like that roaring lion we mentioned earlier.
Which brings us to section 3, the monastic champion.
Now, we have to remain objective reporters here. Our source manuscript takes a very, very hard line on this theological divide. On one side, you have the faith Severus is defending, the belief that Christ's divinity and humanity are completely undivided, forming one single nature. And they trace that view back to the councils of Nicaea and Ephesus. On the exact opposite side, the text vehemently opposes the Council of Chalcedon, framing anyone who believes Christ has 2 distinct natures as direct adversaries. The manuscript doesn't paint this as some polite academic disagreement over tea. It is framed as an existential battle between light and darkness. So how do you fight a battle like that? Well, the author paints this incredible picture, heavily relying on metaphorical anchoring, comparing Severus to David fighting Goliath. But he's armed not with literal stones, but with these 4 gospels to defeat his intellectual enemies. The author tells us that just as David slew the giant Philistine with a single stone from his sling, Severus marched right into the company of hostile kings and bishops, armed only with the 4 Gospels. And the author makes a really specific point to note that the one stone that brought down his opponents was the pure Gospel of John, specifically the verse, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." At this point, Severus has received his training,
He has his spiritual weapons, and his reputation as this brilliant defender of his faith has grown so much that the king himself starts to take notice. We are heading straight into the major conflict of the manuscript.
Section 4. Battling the Chalcedonians.
As Severus is summoned by King Anastasius to face Bishop Macedonius, you really have to ask yourself, how could he possibly win this? Macedonius is an established bishop in Constantinople, sitting in a position of immense, entrenched power and fully backed by a council. Severus is, in his very own words, just a poor monk. Yet King Anastasius summons him specifically because the empire is in complete turmoil over these theological divisions, and he desperately needs someone with the sheer intellect and zeal to debate Macedonius and establish order.
His completely uncompromising defense of his faith is captured perfectly in this dramatic quote. It shows his total reliance on spiritual words rather than physical weapons. While he's journeying to the capital, Severus encounters a fleeing bishop named Anastasius, no relation to the king, just to be clear, who is absolutely terrified of Severus's reputation. Severus delivers this powerful line to him, reinforcing that his warfare is entirely intellectual and theological. He's not there to burn cities down, he is there to dismantle corrupt arguments and expose what he genuinely sees as apostasy.
You can just picture the scene during the showdown at the royal court. It's tense. The crowd is shouting, the king is watching intently, and Macedonius tries his best to defend the Council of Chalcedon. But Severus just zeroes in on the core issue. He accuses Macedonius of being just like the historical heretic Nestorius. He argues that by accepting two natures, Macedonius is separating the divine from the human, effectively splitting Christ right in half. Severus brilliantly leverages historical precedent, comparing Macedonius to figures the church had already cast out, and completely corners the bishop using his own theological framework. And finally, Section 5, Triumph of the Faith. The narrative concludes with a total, sweeping victory for Severus. He successfully purifies the church and sways the king, all without shedding a single drop of physical blood. When King Anastasius sees that Macedonius utterly refuses to turn from his stance, a council in Phoenicia officially excommunicates the bishop. The king and his princes firmly accept Severus's explanation of the faith. Against literally all worldly logic, this solitary monk armed with the four Gospels completely outmaneuvered the established bishop, bringing his ship to port, as the author beautifully puts it, and restoring peace to the church. The author wraps the whole epic up by praising Severus as a brand new David who successfully uprooted the schismatics and secured the spiritual inheritance. The manuscript tells us that his words went forth into all the earth, clearing away the thorns and planting the true vine. Ultimately, he is celebrated not for military conquests, but for providing spiritual salt and heavenly manna through his teachings and canons. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder. It really shows just how deeply the power of an explainer armed with core texts can change history. Saint Severus didn't have a massive army backing him up. What he had was a profound, unshakable understanding of his source material and the absolute conviction to articulate it clearly. In a world today where we are constantly debating ideas and fighting for clarity, this 6th century epic is a stark reminder that the right words, delivered with unwavering belief, truly do have the power to shift the course of empires. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the narratives that shape our world.